The wind began its assault on Willow Creek hours before anyone realized how bad the storm would become, rattling old rooftops like angry fists and bending the tall pines along the highway until they groaned like mourners at a funeral. And in the small, quiet cabin sitting 3 miles off the main road, a single father and war veteran named Jack Harlow listened to the rising chaos with a familiar sense of calm that only a man who had survived worse could possess. He had seen sandstorms in Kandahar that turned daylight to darkness, mortar blasts that shook the ground from beneath him, and nights where fear prowled every shadow like a predator, but nothing frightened him anymore except the thought of failing his 9-year-old daughter Lily, who sat curled on the worn sofa with a book in her lap and worry pooling in her big, soft eyes as thunder cracked across the land like an artillery shell, asking in a small voice if the storm would be bad, to which Jack simply smiled and told her they'd seen worse, because he knew that children borrowed courage from the adults they trusted most, and he intended to be her shelter no matter what the world threw at their tiny family. Yet even as he reassured her, something heavy and instinctual twisted in his gut, that sixth sense veterans never truly lost, the one that whispered when danger was near, and it was that inner alarm that made him glance toward the window just in time to see an unexpected line of headlights cutting through the sheets of rain, 15 of them, moving slow, steady, and thunderous, the kind of formation that wasn't accidental, and as they drew closer, he recognized the unmistakable silhouettes of motorcycles, Harley's big ones, customized and roaring like beasts hungry for a fight, and he knew exactly what kind of men rode them. The leather cuts, the thunderous engines, the disciplined formation even in a storm. It was the Hells Angels, and not just a few stragglers but an entire small chapter, rolling straight toward his home, their headlights flickering like angry eyes in the violent rain. And as they turned onto his muddy driveway, Jack's muscles tensed out of instinct, memories of war blending with the lessons he learned working law enforcement after he came home, because men like that didn't travel this deep into nowhere without a reason, and storms weren't enough to stop them unless something serious drove them off the highway. Lily followed his gaze, her breath catching as the massive figures rolled into view, engines low and rumbling like an approaching avalanche, their riders coated in rain and road grit, their faces hard and unreadable even from a distance, and Jack felt the old version of himself, the one with a rifle and a mission snap, awake, assessing threats, counting bodies, tracking angles, identifying the one who seemed to lead the pack, a towering man with braided gray hair, a weather-beaten face, and a patch that read Reaper, President. Jack told Lily to stay inside and keep the dog close, then stepped out onto the porch as the first bike rolled to a stop, the storm slamming sideways rain against his flannel shirt, the wood creaking beneath his boots, and when the riders cut their engines, the sudden quiet was eerie, broken only by the storm's rage and the faint ticking of cooling metal. Reaper removed his helmet with deliberate calm, revealing eyes that had seen battlefields of a different kind, and for a moment the two men simply studied each other through the rain, one a former soldier who had lost too much, the other an outlaw who had probably taken more than he cared to admit, and Jack could tell instantly this wasn't a social call. Reaper finally spoke, his voice deep and gravelly, saying they'd been caught by the storm when a mudslide closed the highway, and 2 of their men went skidding into a ditch, and now their bikes were dying. Their phones had lost signal, and the nearest shelter was Jack's cabin, adding that they didn't want trouble, just a place to ride out the worst of the storm before they tried to get back on the road. And Jack, who had every reason to distrust men who lived by their own code, felt that strange gut impulse again, the one that whispered not fear but something else, maybe empathy, maybe understanding, maybe the memory of all the nights he himself had needed help from strangers in deserts far from home. He weighed his options fast, knowing that turning away 15 bikers in a storm could become a much bigger problem than letting them inside, and that Lily's safety was the only true factor in his decision. But when he saw one of the younger bikers limping, his arm wrapped in a crude bandage soaked with blood, Jack understood the situation wasn't posturing. They were genuinely struggling. And he also knew that men in pain made desperate decisions if denied help. So he stepped aside, voice steady, telling them they could come in. But any weapon stayed outside and any trouble ended immediately, laying down rules with the clean precision of a man who had commanded soldiers before. And Reaper nodded with a look that wasn't quite respect but something close, signaling his men to comply. And one by one, the legendary outlaws filed toward the cabin, dripping water, smelling of gasoline and storm air, their boots heavy against the porch as Lily watched from the doorway with a mix of fear and awe, gripping Jack's hand as if he were the only anchor she had in a world suddenly filled with giants. Inside, the bikers warmed themselves by the fire Jack built, removing soaked jackets and checking damage on their injured brother while Jack retrieved his old medic kit from a drawer he hadn't opened in years, his movements automatic and practiced as he cleaned the wound, stitched it with sure hands, wrapped it tightly, and surprised the hardened gang with the quiet competence of a man who didn't brag, didn't boast, didn't flinch, just acted when action was needed. Reaper watched him closely, eyes narrowing with curiosity as if Jack were more puzzle than threat. And eventually he asked who Jack used to be, because no ordinary man carried himself with that level of presence. But Jack only replied that he was a father, which made Reaper grin in a way that hinted at a dark past but an oddly strong code of honor, saying that in their world, being a father was the toughest job of all. The storm howled outside, stronger than ever, isolating the small cabin from the rest of the world. And as Jack set aside his tools and checked on Lily, who had retreated behind the dog but still peeked out with fascination, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. The sense that fate had pushed him into a moment that would change everything, that this night wouldn't end quietly, and that when morning finally came, the entire town of Willow Creek would talk about what happened in Jack and Harlow's cabin until the story became legend, though none of them could possibly imagine the truth of what was about to unfold. Before the storm ended and the sun rose again, morning crept over Willow Creek with a strange, uneasy calm, the storm clouds pulling back, like a curtain to reveal a world washed, clean but trembling from the night before. And inside Jack Harlow's small cabin, the 15 Hell's Angels stirred from their makeshift sleeping spots, some on the floor, some in chairs, one leaning against the wall like he'd slept through firefights before, while Jack brewed coffee with the quiet, controlled movements of a man who always wakes early because danger never sleeps. And as the scent filled the room, Reaper stepped outside to check the bikes, only to stop dead on the porch, staring at something that made his breath catch. Jack joined him, expecting more storm damage, but instead he saw a long line of pickup trucks and sheriff's cruisers creeping up the road, townsfolk sticking their heads out windows, some holding binoculars, some gripping phones, because word had spread like wildfire that a gang of Hell's Angels had taken shelter with the war veteran who lived in the woods, and panic had gripped the town before breakfast. Jack muttered a curse under his breath. He knew how people worked, how fear painted monsters out of men, how stories twisted into threats, so he stepped forward, shoulders squared, daughter safe inside, and waited for Sheriff Dalton to step out of his vehicle. A man Jack once called a friend before drifting away from town life, and Dalton looked at him like he wasn't sure whether he was greeting a neighbor or negotiating with a hostage, asking carefully if everything was all right inside, which made Reaper give a dry laugh that unnerved the watching crowd. Jack explained calmly but firmly that the storm had forced the bikers off the road, that he had taken them in, treated an injured man, fed them, watched them, and that no one in his home was in danger. But Dalton's hand hovered near his holster, more out of nerves than threat, until Lily suddenly stepped onto the porch with her dog beside her, looking up at the gathering crowd with sleepy innocence. And the entire town froze because nothing diffuses fear like the sight of a child standing unharmed among supposed monsters. Reaper, sensing an opportunity, walked forward with surprising gentleness, kneeling to thank Lily for the blanket she'd given one of his men during the night. And when she told him, he looked scary but wasn't. Even Dalton's tension cracked into a reluctant smile. Soon the bikers stepped outside one by one, not posturing, not intimidating, but stretching stiff limbs and quietly preparing their gear. And the people of Willow Creek, once trembling, began whispering in confusion, because these men didn't behave like the threats they expected. Jack proposed helping the group get back to the highway, and before long, neighbors who had come ready to accuse were now hauling toolboxes, gas cans and chains to pull bikes free of the mud. And a strange, almost unbelievable sight unfolded. Townspeople and outlaw bikers working side by side beneath the growing sunlight, laughing, lifting, pushing, until every bike roared back to life. Reaper clasped Jack's hand with a grip that spoke of deep, silent respect, promising that the angels never forgot the ones who stood with them when the world didn't. And as the engines thundered away, kicking dust into the morning air, the town watched in awe, realizing the man they thought was a quiet veteran living off-grid had just brokered peace with one of the most feared motorcycle clubs in the country. And when Lily tugged Jack's sleeve and whispered, "Are they bad guys or good guys?" he answered softly, "Most people are somewhere in between." And though the angels vanished down the highway within minutes, the story of what happened that night spread far beyond Willow Creek, retold by bikers and townsfolk alike. A reminder that courage, compassion, and trust can turn strangers into allies. And if you enjoyed this story and want more like it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next adventure.